And I have a co-chair. What a helpful thing.
Pete,
I
can you hear me?
can, but not out of the speaker I want to hear you out of. So let me see if I can switch that. Yeah.
Not my problem
No.
on my end.
Let's see.
Sure, it was working.
Do. Hello, Alexis. We'll let people trickle in for a bit longer.
So, Pete, are you ready to get going?
Boy, the delay in unmuting is impressive. Yes. Why don't we get going? I hope everyone has had a chance to read over the note that I sent out yesterday. And if you haven't looked, Brian Carpenter mentioned that he's not going to be able to attend, so sent his own comments on those. Um, we'll start by mentioning, although I hope I don't have to display that this is an IETF meeting and therefore the note well is in effect. So all of IETF processes and procedures, including, well, it's not an IETF meeting actually, it's an RSWG meeting, but we operate under the note well, which means that you are participating and contributing, and IPR rules may be engaged, as will um, uh, behavior rules and all of the other processes and procedures that we engage in. If you've got questions about that, let me know. Otherwise, basically, Russ and I chatted yesterday, as I mentioned, with Ecker to sort of do the transition to the new chair. And welcome, Russ. Thank you for jumping in on this, and congratulations. Um, and as far as interim for today and tomorrow, we are basically going to open the floor to discussion of this sort of broader question of what we want out of stability, out of archival, out of presentation formats. Um, my impression for the past month or so is that we've been dancing around, sometimes talking at cross purposes. And so I'd like people to sort of hone in on those questions that I put up in that message yesterday. Whoever wants to jump in, we can use the queue, or you can just unmute your mic, and if it gets messy, we can go to the queue. But Joel, go right ahead.
Thank you, Pete. You did raise interesting questions in that email, and it made me think, so thank you to start with. But I'm not at all sure that the questions actually get us where we need to go, because where I ended up was thinking about all the ways that the hypothetical you laid out could go wrong, having nothing to do with the question you were trying to raise. Because the difference between pre-generated renderings and we're going to render them on the fly for all of them has very different impacts for how things go wrong in other regards. And I simply have trouble, therefore, using that as a paradigm to figure out what do I consider stable. I do think we had agreed that re-rendering when useful was okay. That was in the rules we wrote before. That we didn't say just re-render them all the time. I don't know if that would fall within it or not, because I'm not sure it's a good idea in and of itself, and therefore I'm not sure I can get to would it be within the rules. Thank you.
And you know, I put the hypothetical out there that way simply because, and notice I did say in the hypothetical, let's say that that the production center determined that it would be a lot cheaper and a lot more efficient, and that it would be incredibly useful, right? We were going to premise that. What I wanted to get an idea of from folks was whether you thought, even in that scenario, it wouldn't be a good idea for other reasons. Jay, go ahead.
Thanks. I didn't have quite the same view as Joel, but I did feel that about the first question. The questions 2, 3, 4, and 5 I thought were good questions, but the one I had too many sort of oh, what about this? What about that? How about those hypotheticals? That was the one that just seemed to be really stretching the hypothetical bit. So more understanding about what you thought you were getting at with question 1 would be, I think, helpful for me to understand it.
So, question 1 was the thought experiment, right? What I want to, what I was drilling down into was, at least from Martin's proposal, and Martin can correct me if I'm wrong. At least from Martin's proposal, my impression was that he sort of considered presentation to be simply, um, what people will read day to day, but wasn't the essential thing that we need to save, the essential thing that we need to keep stable. The essential thing that we needed to keep stable was the XML, and Martin's document was talking in terms of what changes could we make to XML that would be acceptable. And my impression started to become, after some of the discussion, that some people felt that no, presentation formats also needed to be stable. And so I wanted to drill down on how essential was presentation to format to people. And maybe there's different levels, but sort of to get into what is the policy statement we want to make, because the policy has always been the XML is stable, period, and nothing further. And I wanted to see if we could drill down a bit. So go ahead, Jay.
Thank you. So look, ultimately, I feel that these questions are inadvertently coming from the wrong direction, that they're coming from the view of the producers rather than the consumers. And that the big issue I have with a lot of the things we do about the RSC editor site and our publication is that we design it around the producers, not the consumers. So it's what do consumers need and what do consumers want that are I think the more important things to nail down, and that then drives down to some of the answers about these questions. I think doing it this way around is well, just problematic for me, really. That's all. Not to say I'm not willing to do it. I'm very willing to give you answers in triplicate if you want about these things, but it just feels like the wrong direction.
Fair enough. Elliot, go ahead.
Oh, that's good, Jay. Because for a moment there, I thought you were going to be shy or something. So thank goodness for that. I mostly agree with Jay, but I've been trying to understand, in the conversation, sort of where I think where Martin and I think also Karsten and others are coming from. I think there's a desire, right, to increase sort of feature velocity and to provide that feature velocity across, the existing product line when we can. And at the same time, right, there's also a need for the tool chain to be able to do that such that you don't keep so many forks of the software that you don't know how to fix old stuff. And I feel like that a lot of the discussion has been coming from that. And so before I go answering questions, I just want to get that out that I see that as a root issue for where it comes into conflict with some of the stability discussions that Joel and I have been talking about. And just to add one little bit of flavor to that, I don't mind us talking about wanting to get to, say, a place where we have that feature velocity, but what I am a little concerned about is doing it too quickly. So if we do things sort of step by step, I think that will be at least a little more palatable. I'll stop there just to listen to. I know Eric, you have probably a similar view to Martin, maybe different nuances, and then I'm dying to hear what Martin has to say, and I'm sure Alexis, you have plenty to say here too. So.
Thanks, Elliot. Go ahead, Ecker. And welcome to the land of being able to make whatever comment you feel like without having to be neutral.
Exactly. I've been preparing my complaints with the chairing, offline. I guess I'm not sure I'm ready to answer these questions just yet, but I think I wanted to maybe try to see if we can level set on some general understanding. So I think the first thing I would say is I think like what people consume and what the authors basically review is one of the presentation formats. Now, probably not all of the people consume all of them. Obviously, the authors, in my experience, review one, and maybe glance at the XML. But I don't think I certainly in the entire time I've been in IETF, I don't think it really reassured myself the XML was like doing what I thought it was, except by running it through the formatter and seeing what the output was. So I think that if anybody really disagrees with that, I think that'd be useful to speak up. So I think that's actually an assertion about about the way things behave. The second, I think, the more controversial thing, but I think still a plausible assertion, is that if things are not treated as if they have to be never change, then the stakes of screwing up are lower. And so, to maybe this circles a little bit to your hypo, if it is the case that we re-render, that you re-render every time, and people suspect they're re-rendering every time, then if you screw up the rendering once or twice and someone catches it, that's not the biggest crisis in the world. It's worth noting web servers, they could the data could be contaminated, they can serve the wrong data at any time. I mean, the minute you allow the data to change at all, then there's always the chance that some re-rendering will produce errors, and unless we have some sort of ledger or something that's ensuring it's all the same, there's always some chance of error. So I think while I'm not sure how I feel about this typo of constantly rendering, I guess I do think that if we can, if we persuade ourselves that the presentation formats ever change at all, and that there's a process for doing that can be exercised in situations other than extremis, then the cost of error in a rendering will become somewhat lower.
That's helpful. Thanks. Martin, you're up.
I think Eka's point largely aligns with mine. The sort of underlying philosophy, I think Elliot managed to capture reasonably well here, which is that the interpretation of 7990 and friends, from my perspective, is one that where the XML is the thing, but Eka's point about what people consume and use and whatever is totally relevant here. There's a number of cut points in this, and Pete, I think you've really taken the extreme one in your note, which was to say that the renderings can change anytime. And I think what I'm seeing from the discussion is that people are looking for somewhat more stability from those things, or at least some ability to go back in time and find those versions of things that were rendered in a particular way at a particular point in time, just because we wanted to make sure that that's absolutely the right thing to do. Or there was a mistake or something like that. But what I really want to get toward is an understanding that we have two layers of things. One is that mistakes in the presentation format, whether they come about as a result of tools or external factors, can be corrected relatively cheaply. I've been having a discussion with the RPC about doing precisely this because there are a number of errors in the presentation of existing RFCs. And also the fact that we can take an XML document and whenever it was published and use the modern tools to process them. We don't force someone to go and find a copy of XML to RFC from the time at which that particular RFC was published and use that in order to ensure that they get exactly the right whatever it is. And that means a little bit of care, but I think if you look at the sorts of things that John was proposing here, that's exactly what this group is good for, is understanding exactly the extent of which the changes we're making will have, and being deliberate about those changes.
Thanks. That I'm tempted to add to the list of questions something about, a hypothetical. If we find errors in the presentation that do not, and it's not an error in the XML, it's an error in the presentation, is that okay, and what ought we do about that? But yeah, thanks. That's helping me. Alexis?
Hi. Yeah, so I guess I'm seeing this as two completely separate issues. One is the re-rendering of access formats, not the XML, re-rendering of access formats. And we already have done that. We need to be able to do that. It would be ridiculous not to do that. For many reasons, having errors show up that are format errors, or that end of things, or there's new accessibility standards that we need to meet, or there's we want to change the way that the HTML looks, or whatever it is, right? To the idea that we can't change the access formats, to me, is kind of absurd. And as long as we are kind of keeping dated versions of them, which is kind of an easy and already solved issue, I don't see any problem whatsoever with doing that. And this is not the group of people that's going to do stuff willy-nilly. So I'm not too worried about, like, let's just change it because it's Thursday. That doesn't seem like a reasonable fear. The bigger question to me is, can we change the XML, which I feel like we don't really get into in this. And I don't know if that's something that you want to actually talk about here.
I guess if we start to come to some consensus about presentation formats, and that they're changeable, but not because the breeze blew out of the south and I have an itch in my left ear, I think that helps me to sort of move along to the question of, okay, what, if anything, about the XML can change over time, and what are the criteria for that? It also leads me to believe that there's policy that can be written about presentation formats that I don't think is solidly written at the moment. So Yeah, I do think we get to the question of what's changeable in the XML. A lot of my questions were really about people seem to be going back and forth about issues that seem to have to do with presentation and not the XML itself.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, the only questions you asked here about XML was what are the upsides and downsides, right? Like to changing it. To me, the biggest downside of not changing it is enshrining errors, making the old XML versions hard to use in the future. It makes it harder for us to manage the corpus in a sensible way. It's a kind of all downsides to me. The only upside to not changing it, I guess, is that you don't have the potentially introduced errors in content that are possible but not certain. It seems mostly down, like changing the XML seems mostly upside to me in a controlled manner, obviously.
Thanks, Jay.
Thanks. So look, for changing the presentation format, I could see three reasons why you might want to do it. And I think it's important to start with those reasons. One is because there's an error in the underlying data, i.e. the XML, from which the presentation format is derived. A second one is because there's an error in that rendering of that specific presentation thing. And the third one is because we have chosen to enhance the that rendering in some way unique to that rendering. Okay, so for example, with HTML, say we've decided to add double link or metadata to it, for example, or something around that is not about the RFC content, it's about the metadata around it. And I think when we get to those type of things, that then tells from those reasons that drives the views about how often or how we can change, because there's if those are the only reasons, and we then, well, actually, sorry, let me be clear. If we take that, nothing in there drives us towards any particular frequency of changing or anything like that. If we look externally then at other things about what people expect from RFCs in terms of stability, trustworthiness, integrity, that kind of stuff, that's when we then get to the answers about how quickly we can change these things or how often we should change these things. Does that make sense? That's the path we need to be taking to answer these questions from my perspective anyway.
Martin, go ahead. I've got questions, but go ahead and
yeah. So this question of, well, we made a mistake, we need to fix it, I think is a lot easier in a world in which we have a process by which changes are possible. And I think the point of the draft is to describe the process whereby changes are possible in the XML become possible. And that's something that's Robert points out in the chat may actually be necessary for all of the existing RFCs because there are timestamps in those that are not tagged with a time zone, but Pacific time in some way. This is non-consequential to all of the display of those documents, probably, but it has implications for people using the XML in other ways. I think a lot of what we're talking about here is outside of what I believe to be the policies that we'd set out for this group, and I think this is probably an important point to discuss. I think the generation of renderings from XML is something that this group should not express opinions on or should explicitly disavow. In the extreme, and then maybe in like the, I'm willing to go as far as saying that this group is probably in a better position to say when we're done and set some ground rules for the renderings, but nothing nothing much, and leaving that to operational practice, RPC policies rather than this group's policies. That was my interpretation of 7990X, but I'd be interested to see what others do.
Anybody want to speak to that? My cat apparently does, which is why I'll keep muting.
If I can back up to Jay's separations, I like those. And if I look at, I'm not sure I want this group to be entirely hands off, but I think mostly hands off of making rendering decisions. The only, I'm going to sound like a broken record, so I'll just say this again and then I'll stop saying it. The only thing I ask is that we be incremental in our approach. So what I liked about your questions, Pete, was that you sort of hit the polls, if you will. And, it goes back to, the old Leslie Daigle thing. What does good look like? Right. And if we decide that, good, it means that we can change the renderings when we have the, in all of those three categories, we might have different rules for how we change them in those categories. And I think that's okay. And as long as we take it incrementally to get there, and we start with the easy, and we take on the medium, and then we do work on the hard, right? I think we can probably get there at a reasonable pace, but we get some operational experience under our belts in terms of how we do this. And when we started this discussion, the draft read a little bit more. Not in the way that Martin intended it to, and I took it in a way that he certainly didn't intend it, and where we would have to do exactly what you said in your message, right? Re-render everything all the time, and that certainly wasn't his intent. So if we take things at a certain pace, I think that's a good way to go. The other aspect that we should just capture, though, is how we reference our works, how those references remain stable in terms of what they are, and also readable, right? If a reference becomes a hash, we're in trouble. So I'll stop there.
I want to, before you totally leave us, Elliot, I wanted to push on your use of the word we and ask about Martin's question, which is, should we as a working group be setting policy about, rate of change, et cetera, and so forth, or should we leave that mostly to the RPC and give broad guidance? Or no guidance at all?
Yeah, in general, I agree that we should be giving broad guidance, but we certainly don't want to be involved in every change. But we might want to start by saying, let's try a few specific, if the people want to do big changes, maybe the first couple of times bring them to the RSWG, right? So we see what that's like, and then we get a feel for what we have to pass judgment on and what we don't have to pass judgment on. One of the problems we have is we have a whole new, it's not as new as it was, right? But we have a relatively new structure, right? And so we need to learn how to use it. And I don't want to get into the RPC's business too much, right? Certainly if they spot errors, then they should feel free to correct. I don't see real, especially on individual drafts, individual RFCs. I myself, we had this brief discussion on RFC interest, right? Martin filed a bug against Netscape in terms of a rendering. I actually did the same and got duped because I then spotted Martin's bug. Those sorts of things where we might have to re-render a small number of RFCs because of that, or even a large number of RFCs, so long as it's done with great care, where there's an error, I'm pretty much okay with that. When we start talking about re-rendering in order to add new features, I would like to just pause before we do that and see how the rest of the re-rendering process works first.
Okay. Oh, Rich decided not to be in the queue. So Joel, go ahead.
Okay. So trying to take apart the subtleties of what was asked, as long as we stick with the notion that the content of the XML, let's not worry about the exact details, we'll come back to that in a moment, but the content of the XML is the definition of the content of the RFC, then I think we should stay as far away from controlling or talking about policy on the rendering as practical. There may be some corners where we have to say, hey, don't go overboard, but in general, we should be staying away from it. The RPC and the tools folks have to work out what has to be done, have to fix bugs if things don't work, if things get render wrong, etc. So as long as we stick with that premise, but I'm specifying that caveat over again because it is very clear that there are folks who don't want to stick with that premise. And if we change the premise, then the whole question of rendering suddenly becomes much more important. And exactly how we change the premise determines what we need to have policy about. And I don't want to speculate. As long as we take that view, I do think we still should allow changes to the XML which do not change the content of the RFC. I don't actually think we need to go retrofit time zones into the old ones. I think that's a bad example. Heck, we had ones that had only months in them. It's okay. The world didn't stop because you didn't know exactly what day in February of that particular year the document was published. It won't stop because you didn't actually know for 100% provably certain what time it was really published. Heck, we don't even know what time it was really published. Time zone is a mark we put in it to give a reference. I have no problem with putting in time zones in the future, but I don't think there's any need to go back and fix the XML for that. On the other hand, if we're not going to be able to use that DAG postal line library, we have to do something so we can render stuff. That's a real problem. I'm not going to pretend it's not. But we should be focusing, but from where I sit, it's, well, things that have to be fixed that do not change the semantic content of the RFC, okay, we grudgingly allow them to be fixed in the XML. Changes to
I think we lost. Did everybody else lose Joel? I lost Joel.
I can't hear him either.
Okay. Now you're. Thank you. Yes, go ahead, Joel. Just the last sentence disappeared. You actually were fine until moments before I said that.
okay, then don't worry about it. It looks like
Good.
Jay and you folks heard the point I was trying to make, and I don't need to repeat myself.
Good. Rich, you're back in the queue. Go right ahead.
Okay. So the question of, it doesn't change, as long as it doesn't change the content of the XML. Suppose somebody transitions. Suppose somebody, and they don't want their dead name associated anymore. Does that count? If you're looking to see what somebody has authored before and after they've transitioned, I mean, how do you can't, it's hard to do those kind of searches. And I was primarily a minor comment. The one I want to know more is, I guess it's a question to the chairs. If we decided that HTML5 was the definitive version of an RFC, can we make that recommendation to the RSWG? Or is that out of scope for us? Can we say no, XML is not the definitive version? The official version of an RFC is the HTML that was published.
I mean, answering for myself, that I thought you were asking a different question. That to me sounds like something we could do with buy-in from the streams. I don't think we would ever deign to do that independently.
Okay.
But I think if we were, that would be a significant policy change that we could theoretically make.
Okay.
A
And
little unimaginable. Yeah.
Yeah, I,
so then
conclusion there. That would be a change. Then we'd have to publish an RFC to make it.
okay.
Yeah. The interesting thing, I thought you were asking like Robert's, or what about HTML6 question, and that sounded to me like, well, maybe that's too minor to put in an RFC. But no, you were asking the bigger question of if we wanted to change what the underlying canonical, archival, most important Uber, whatever you want to call it, format was from XML to HTML. We would have to write an RFC and get everybody's buy-in and blah, blah, blah.
Because I think that thinking about that, then the question becomes, who are we here to serve? The people writing the RFCs or the much larger community that reads them? And I think Ecker is going to support this question based on the chat. But I'll stop.
Go ahead, Ecker.
Yeah, so I think I am, in fact, first I said earlier, like the notion that like the XML is somehow the version that people rely on is a polite fiction. It is not. And so I don't want to, I mean, we have a number of terms people suggested, canonical, definitive, whatever. But if you imagine some hypothetical defect in which the XML clearly said one thing, but the XML RFC clearly like did something else, changed a 1 to a 0 or 0 to 1, and it did so in all the renderings. We would not go, we would look extremely silly and sustain that the value is actually the thing in XML, because that is not how people interpret the situation. So so whatever like terms we wish to apply to it, the thing that is important is the formats that people consume, and as I argued earlier, produce. So I think that's the first thing I'd like to say. The second is, it seems to me that there really are three tiers of changes one might imagine to these documents, however one can see to them. One is, I think, the ones that Joel was saying don't change the content, namely, sorry, maybe 4 tiers. There's things that are bit for bit identical, namely say like change the XML, but every single rendering format is identical because like say we added a space or something that is not non-semantic in an XML language. Then there are things which I think we agree don't change the content in any meaningful way, but do change the bit for bit rendering. So change a page break, or maybe add a period or something like that, like fix a typographical error. Then there are things of the form that Rich suggested, which do change the content but not the semantics, changing people's email addresses or changing people's names. And then finally, you have semantic changes. And I think all 4 of those need to be like potentially considered. I think the ones that like I think obviously you would need one could draw the line anywhere. If you draw the line, and currently the line is like is like at the very bottom, right? Like you can't change any of it. And we're talking moving the line upward. I think I don't think it's a secret that I probably think the line ought to be drawn between semantic and content, semantic and like text. But I think you could draw the line anywhere. But as I say, and of course, you have to consider the line being drawn both in terms of the input format and the output format. So I think one could easily have a position that said you can make any change actually you want to the XML as long as it doesn't have any downstream changes on the rendering format. Would be a coherent position.
Martin, go ahead.
Level, I'm kind of okay with Ecker's position here, which is like we should make it the thing that people use. The problem is that there's no one thing that people use, and I'm also kind of at the view that we should probably do this incrementally and do small steps at a time. And I heard Joel basically earlier saying exactly what the draft that I wrote attempts to say. And so I think that if we try to concentrate on those questions, we would get ourselves a little bit further in this conversation. I think Eka's ultimately right. People read the text and HTML versions. I don't know how many people read PDF, but that's another problem. The questions that I think are most important in this context are understanding what guidance we give the RPC in terms of generating the presentation formats, and what changes we allow now and then in the future to the source format. And I think that's where I'd like us to concentrate our efforts. Incrementally, incremental changes as opposed to big ones.
The queue is empty. People feel like what needs to be said has been said, or aren't sure where to go next. Yeah, Ecker.
There's been a bunch of discussion about the potential reason we might want to say here. I'm not sure I've had anybody say that Martin's draft goes too far, as understood by the way people have been characterizing it here. So I think it might be useful to hear, are there people who think that Martin, like, I'm not sure it goes far enough, but I'm fine with doing it. So are there people here who think Martin's draft goes too far? And if so, as understood by as being expounded here. And if so, let's hear those arguments. And if not, then maybe we can try to move forward with something like Martin's draft.
I like that. So are there folks who think that Martin's draft goes too far? Elliot, go ahead.
So I just want to back up and say, yeah, I had some concerns with Martin's draft. I don't know if you've updated it recently, Martin. You know, we talked about a couple of changes. And I think the key thing that I'd like the draft to reflect is what you said, right? Let's be incremental about how we go about this. It's okay to do a couple of RFC revs on this, in my opinion, in terms of policy, like so that we set the policy to, to slow start, and then we reset the policy to have a broader scope to allow more change as we get more experience. And I'd like to see that covered. If we can get that in there, I think I'd feel more comfortable about just allowing for some additional operational experience. So as long as we're there, I can probably live with what's there. But until that's there, we should be. I just want us to be careful with the series. That's all.
Go ahead, Jay.
Thank you. One of the things that comes in one of your later questions that I think it is worthwhile discussing is if the underlying XML changes, do we automatically have to re-render all of the renderings? And going back to my view about stability, I don't believe that we have to have a currently published set where all of the renderings have been derived from the current renderings have been derived from the current source. What matters to me is the correctness of the content. So it's perfectly possible that we may do something in the XML. Say we may change the XML to add some new features to it that do not affect the PDF rendering. Okay. In that circumstance, I see no reason to re-render the PDF. In fact, I actually think it's preferable to leave the PDF as it is rather than to re-render it. And I think that's quite an important point again about the stability of the series is the the implications of these changes and how they then run through the rest of them.
Martin.
Response to Elliot there, I heard what he said on the mailing list. I have an open pull request against the draft that sort of tries to capture some of the intent. I think I may have shared that on the list at one point. I can make a revision to the draft at any time. There just wasn't enough change queued up to really make that worthwhile. But I can certainly do that if that makes people more comfortable.
Go ahead, Eric.
So to briefly respond to Jay, I think it would also be okay if we did not re-render all the documents at the time that the tools changed. I think if the XML changed the document, we should re-render it. That's seems like bad practice not to. I think if the tools changed, I don't think it's necessary to re-render it necessarily. But I think I want to distinguish between, de minimis changes to the output and real changes to the output. So concretely, the outputs maybe have a timestamp in them, and if nothing that changes but the timestamp, then I think it's reasonable. Then I think it's reasonable to say, well, the old rendering is fine. But as a matter of software validity, the software should be regenerating every time we make a change to the XML. We should be regenerating all the RSCs and verifying that only the minimis and intended changes were made to the outputs. Because it's just simply a matter of having appropriate software engineering practice. I think if you did that, then it'd be fine to say, well, the only difference in the output A and output B is the timestamp, and we're not going to update the timestamp effectively. Is a fine thing to say. And then, of course, I will repeat what I said earlier, which is if we get comfortable doing the renderings reasonably frequently when we need to, then it will be less of an issue if we accidentally inadvertently introduce a change which we didn't mean to, and it looks bad. And then we're like, well, now I guess we'll push the re-render button, it'll be fine. So I think if we make re-rendering a low cost operation, then it becomes less important to re-render every time.
Go ahead, Alexis.
Yeah, so I actually agree with Ecker. If anything's going to change in the renderings, we need to re-render all of them. I think that's a really good plan. If we don't think anything's going to change in the re-renderings, I don't think we need to republish anything, but I do think we probably need some amount of say a corpus of things that we think are edge cases, right, where the kinds of documents where things tend to break, that we do at least review and make sure we're not inadvertently changing anything. This is a very broad thing to say. I don't know exactly what thing would be, changing and how it would change, right? But I would imagine that we have some known problem documents or some known problem scenarios that we could test things against when things get changed, whether we publish them or not.
Yep. Jay.
Thanks. I think it's important to remember that, I will explain. I think that re-rendering is a high-risk operation and is inevitably a high-risk operation, because I do not think that there is any practical mechanism whereby we can take two renderings of the same thing and ensure that we have not accidentally damaged it somehow, the content, without using a lot of human resources to do that. I think by the very nature of it, it's not something that the correctness can be checked easily automatically across that. And therefore, for me, that makes it high risk, and therefore that's something that I would suggest we try to avoid doing, except when we have to. It should not become, even if it becomes a trivial thing to do, technically, it still, to me, is not something we should be doing unless we have to.
Can you drill down a little for me on the risk you're talking about?
Yeah, well, the risk is that the new rendering has a bug in it that misses some part of the content or something. So we've had regular examples of PDFs rendered with bits missing from them. Okay, so we have there are all sorts of things that can go wrong within the rendering, but detecting those is a hard problem. And that's why I don't think we should be doing it, except, when we have to.
Can I jump the queue on that one? Do people mind? Yeah, 'cause I just want to say this is sort of the discussion that John Levine and I had, right? So if and this goes, and Jay, you're in a really good position to really develop on this point, which is if we have if we have the automation to spot the changes, and there is some automation out there, if we have the automation to spot the changes, and we know the sorts of changes that are allowable and not, very sort of CI/CD-ish, if you will, I think if we can get to that point, that would be very nice. The tooling that I looked at, I don't think it was quite at that level at this point, but I won't claim to have the corner of knowledge on that. So that was the discussion that John and I had online. And this is again, if we start slow, and the other issue I wanted to mention, right, is we might not catch the change if we don't have that automated tooling. We might not catch that change for years. And also, going to a point that Ecker made, right, if there is a change, right, and the authors aren't available, right, do we really, or if the ISG has turned over, if it's whatever the case may be, right, if we're not sure about what was supposed to have been there in the first place, we could end up in some confusion. Okay, thanks for letting me jump the queue.
Okay, go ahead, Joel.
Okay, I think I'm going to be saying largely what Jay said from a slightly different angle. We had this discussion on the list. People said we need to re-render in order to know if we worked it right. And I asked, how the heck would you know if you did it right? Because you can't tell. And yes, there are things you can check, but you can't automatically check all of the aspects. And we can't manually check each and every one. So in fact, the claim that we would be incurring technical debt if we don't re-render them doesn't actually seem to stand up, because we can't avoid the technical debt by re-rendering them. I am not prepared to turn the community of users of the RFC series into beta testers of our changes. That is, as far as I'm concerned, an unacceptable. I don't care that game companies do it all the time. It is not the way we're going to produce RFCs as far as I'm concerned. Now, I'm not the definer, but it doesn't work for me. And if we can't test them, actually avoid.
Ecker.
Yeah, so maybe I tried to tease a few things apart. First of all, I think there's, and I'm happy to have another word, there's re-render and there's publish re-render. So my position is, to be clear, that the system should, in continuous integration, re-render every single RFC and check it against the previous rendering, and then throw it away. It's fine. But it should regenerate it, and that's a form of testing for regression, right? And then and I'm more than happy in those circumstances to not publish the output, but you should be rerunning the tools. With respect to Jay's point, I'm sorry, but I don't understand the argument here. Like, the check should be, is it bit for bit identical modulo of the changes we know it introduces. And if the tool chain, if you're introducing changes to the tool chain that are producing bit for bit not identical things, and you didn't mean it, you have problems with the tool chain. And so like so like that's a and there's no ways to deal with this, which is you rerun the tools, and if it's bit for bit identical, then you're fine. If it's not bit for bit identical, then you examine every single change to be sure if they're correct or not, and then once you're satisfied, then you basically say, okay, this is now the new canonical, sorry, not canonical, the new thing as which I'm comparing. And if our system is not stable against that, then we have huge software engineering problems that are much that go beyond publication. And again, I'm perfectly happy not to publish any of those outputs. So I'm not here to fight with Joel about that topic. And finally, like we do in fact, like systems are like much bigger than this. You know, like web browsers run tests against web pages and with a much more complicated rendering system and verify that there are only de minimis changes in the rendering. Like this is a standard part of regression testing for a web browser. And so the idea that like we have tools which can verifiably produce text and HTML renderings in a way that does not change between runs, like I don't think it's like a acceptable state of affairs. We should fix it. So again, it's not really a question for the RSWG because I'm perfectly happy to discard those documents. But as a software engineering matter, that is not an acceptable state of affairs for software engineering.
Joel, go ahead.
I think Ecker just hit the main reaction. If it's just a matter of software engineering, then it's not an RSWG question. We don't get to tell the RPC and the tools folks how to conduct their testing. Ecker may well be right about what they should do for testing. He knows that space better than I do by a very, very large margin. But it's not the RSWG's business to say that. The only context in which we would get to a say is if we wanted to demand or prohibit republication of the re-rendered documents. And as much as possible, we should just stay out of it.
Go ahead, Elliot.
Yeah. So where forgive me, it's a little late here. My brain's running just a little bit slower.
And we do have but 4 minutes left, so
yeah. So I'll try and be brief. I think there's a fair amount of common ground here from which we can build. I'm actually pretty optimistic on what I'm hearing. Eric, you do have a lot more experience in that tooling aspect. Like I said, I had that discussion with John online. If we can get to the point where we can spot the de minimis changes and things like that, and they really have to be de minimis, I think a lot of this I'll feel a lot better about all this. So I would suggest, Pete, and group as next steps, right? Which is maybe we chart a path in terms of what we think if we understand what good looks like, where we understand the sorts of changes we want to allow, and we sort of chart a path backwards from that. Say, okay, we're doing, Pete's ultimate re-render-a-thon, in at the end of days, if you will, doing re-rendering but not republishing at some point, and then going backwards from there. And what's our first step? We have to figure that out. And I don't want to micromanage the RPC, but I want to make sure that we're also doing this at a pace where the RPC can learn, get operational experience. Boy, I'm beginning to sound like a broken record again, so I'll stop.
So just to publicly answer Robert's question in addition to in the chat room, my expectation was that tomorrow is going to be continuation, that Russ or I will arm wrestle over who gets to write up at least cheap minutes for tomorrow and continue this. But I think we've stabilized on a couple of issues, which is nice. So my hope is that tomorrow we will continue to get agreement on those issues from who shows up that's different. And then we'll be able to publish, a more finished set of minutes for the whole shebang and get some agreement on the list on that. But it sounds like we're starting to hum in the right direction, or at least in a common direction. We are at time. Anybody got any last minute things, administrative or otherwise? All right, so we have our meeting scheduled for, of course it's not going to give me it in UTC. I can make that happen, I believe. Tomorrow at, is it 1400 UTC? Someone correct me if I'm wrong. Did I get that right?
I think it's 1300 UTC.
1300. That is correct. It is still summertime here in the US for some unknown reason. All right. So 1300 tomorrow UTC, morning for some of us, and hopefully we'll get some more of the European folks to jump in at a more reasonable hour tomorrow. I think that's all I got. Russ, anything from you?
Nope, sounds good. Talk to you tomorrow.
All right. See you and whoever else would like to attend tomorrow.
Bye-bye.